Right, guys. Hey, this is Luke again, and let's take a look at lesson three here. Um, we talked about in lesson two mapping everything out, which is huge. I think once you lay it all out, it makes a lot more sense to you. It's just easier to have that full picture of like why it's easier to me. It's easier to buy in to what you're actually doing at the point you're doing it, right? So I know a lot of times it feels too easy for people in the beginning, but knowing why you're doing that can definitely help you. All right, so lesson three. So that was more, and that really took us more towards building the volume first, right? What are we going to do structurally? And so now what we can do is talk about making sure that we're starting out at the right paces. So let's discuss that. And I think once we have our realistic expectations that are set out and our plan mapped out, the last thing we want to do is ensure that we're at the right intensity. So admittedly, when I wrote the first Hans's Marathon Method book, I don't believe I covered the idea of starting paces well enough, and I still probably need to do better. But the reality is that when I went off of what I knew as far as my experience running with Hanson's, and how the group runs were going for the community and things like that. So I didn't take into account other possible scenarios. And so I think what we did was we always just basically started where we left off because we were never, if we were healthy, and for the most part, I was healthy most of my career, it was basically you ran a marathon and then you took your time off and then you did something else, right? So it wasn't like you had these long layoffs. It wasn't like you went 3 or 4 or 5 years without running a marathon and not really having a good idea of what those paces were. So we always just kind of built one segment onto the next and went from there. So I think we can do a better job of making sure um, we're at the right place, right? And so that brings up the idea of goal pace. In the books, I talk about goal pace almost exclusively. And that is where we want to be ultimately, right? When you get into that last month, you want to be sure that you can hit that goal pace, right? That you have time at that and you know what it feels like, and it feels sustainable. Sometimes it doesn't, but ideally it does. That's where we want to be, but maybe not during the first several weeks of the plan. The first 4 or 5 weeks of that plan, maybe we don't want to be at that goal pace. If you're an experienced runner, chances are you aren't making a huge jump in your goal. So the reality is that the pace is probably only affected by a few seconds a mile. Like 5 seconds a mile can mean a huge difference for you in the marathon, right? 10 seconds a marathon, it's like life changing. But the reality is that the paces they're only going to be effective a few seconds, right? So if I've run 3 hours, the next logical step is probably like 2:57. That's probably not a big difference in overall pace per mile, right? That doesn't change a whole lot what we're doing. But for some, they're really trying to take big chunks of time off, and that's going to affect those goal paces by 15, 20, 30 seconds a mile sometimes, right? And the reality of that means that they might have marathon pace work, which isn't that's not supposed to be that intense, faster than what they've run for a half marathon, right? And so we have to be cognizant of that, right? We don't want to give them a 6 mile tempo run at their half marathon pace that they currently run that we want to be their marathon pace, right? So we've got to do some sort of adjustment there. And then it potentially makes the speed work faster than they've ever run for a 5K. Like that, if we look at that, what it is down the road, like if we're set, perfect example, right? So 3:30, let's say if a person's run 4 hours in the marathon, they want to go after 3:30, which at that level isn't unheard of. But let's say they haven't even broken out 145 and a half. And there might be reasons why this happened, but you know, we might not have been at that point, right? And so if we just go now, we're not only going to make marathon pace what they've run for a half marathon, what's that going to be doing for projected 5K and 10K paces that they're going to be doing for the speed? They might be faster than what they've run for 3 to 5K, right? And so we have to be really cognitive of that. We don't want to send them over the edge. And I think a lot of people tend to do that when just saying, hey, let's just go for this and not necessarily take into account what it does to all of those paces, right? And so it's not sustainable for them, right? They're put themselves behind the 8 ball right away. And to me, that's where the race equivalency calculators come into. We plug in a recent 5K time, it spits out a marathon equivalent, and we just throw it into the pace calculator, right? We just base all our workouts off of that. And that goes back to what I was saying. Like I know I've run 4:15, I can run a 4:15, but what I really want to do is run under 4 hours, and that doesn't seem like a big jump, but it can be because it's grossly overestimating what our current fitness is, right? And so I think race equivalency charts are a tool, but they should be used almost as guidelines. They're just guidelines. They're just one piece of data, right? And it can give us a 30,000-foot view, but let's kind of use that to narrow down into like, what's the 10,000-foot view on that, right? Let's maybe we view them as a ceiling or an end goal as we approach a race specific part of our training, but maybe not where we start our training off those first few weeks. And so with that in mind, maybe we shift our focus towards current paces, or especially when starting in actual paces when formulas don't necessarily line up. I think that the first thing you can do with that is to use some other things, right? We want our baseline fitness. What's our current baseline fitness? And there's some ways we can do that. So one way is looking at what our last race suggests. Excuse me. And it's all about having relevant data and using it to our advantage. So using race data gives us a lot of useful information. So if I just did a summer 5K, 10K series of racing, and I'm looking to transition it into a half marathon, that's going to give me really good data, right? That's going to give me really solid results that I can take with me. That's going to be a closer correlation to what I can actually run for a half marathon than just guessing, right? It gives me workable results. Now that same 5K, it gives me, like I said, a 30,000-foot view for the marathon, but is it going to be that accurate? And if you look at like the post I just did, and if you're underperforming in longer distances, you can go down that rabbit hole. But it can give you a guideline and it can give you potential, but it doesn't necessarily say that's where I'm at right now. And the same thing is true if you just did a half marathon and now you want to do a marathon segment. Half marathon day is going to give you pretty good information for that marathon, but it still might overestimate your current fitness for the marathon. So we have to take that with a grain of salt. All right, so the gray area might come up with, let me see here. With this, we have relevant paces for all goal paces and paces you can plug and play from the races you've run. And that's referring to if I'm using 5K, 10K paces for a half marathon, or I'm using a half marathon race to dictate what I'm looking to do for the marathon, right? So we have that. Or maybe I jumped into, okay, no, I'm good. All right. Gray areas that might come up will be easy, moderate, and long run range. Although, unless things are really out of whack, these paces will largely overlap. There might be some discrepancies, but I don't think I would put too much. There should still be, in those ranges are so big that you're probably going to fall in line with most of those. But use effort as your guide. Use your metrics, like aerobic efficiency and things like that, and you can. And I'll discuss those a little bit more later on. But yeah, you can use those. Use some discernment on that. But for the most part, those are going to largely overlap. And then you can also compare equal distance races to each other. Let's say you are training for a half or a marathon that's pretty flat or hilly, like it's one way or the other, right? But one way or another compared to what you've run in the past. So basically what I'm getting at is if you go to a website, findmymarathon.com, they have a tool on there that you can compare a marathon, right? So let's say I ran Chicago and I got into Boston. I'm running Boston now. And I want to know what an equal performance would be from my Chicago compared to what I could potentially run, same effort, same performance on a course like Boston, right? So that's a good way to compare. So you can kind of get an idea of what to expect for another race. Or, I ran New York and now I'm going to run, I'm running Glass City, which is pretty flat, right? What's an equal performance on that? And that's probably more intuitive for that, right? Because that's directly going to change what we would do for training paces. But you can get an idea of what equal performance, and then it can give you an idea of what paces you should be aiming for going into the next race. I have a link for that in the actual lesson, so you can go in and find that. It's about halfway down, 2/3 down. And then, and just for note, we're not affiliated with them at all. It's a tool we use with our athletes. And so it's something that you might find of value. But yeah, so that's the other thing that I would do is use when you're looking at actual race data. Let me see here. And so then, or the other thing you can do, and I have this under the next section, which is progressing your fitness, but it is something that you can do to find where you're currently at, right? If you just don't really know where you're at and you need a place to start, this can help you out a lot. And I'm not going to talk about it a lot, so I'll just use it in real quick in the same context here. But I have some solid posts on that. One would be, just looking through my notes here. One would be to use something like the 6-minute test. And I have a whole blog on that. I will link to that. That's an easy way to see where you're currently at. It's also a way to progress your fitness once you get through 4 to 6 weeks of training and you want to take that next step to bridge that gap from where you're currently at to reaching your goal paces, right? And so I'm not going to talk about it a lot. Basically, you can do a 6-minute test, which is essentially running as far as you can over 6 minutes, and we can extrapolate some data in there. And it's not going to be perfect, but it gives you pretty good idea of where you're currently at. So I will link to that post, and it comes with a whole calculator, tells you how to do the test, how to plug that information in and pull the useful information that you need out of there. So I won't go too far into that. So as far as progressing fitness, you're like I said, you're at a current pace and you want to get to your goal pace. This is what you want to eventually get to that current, or you want to get to that goal pace. And I already have, so don't think about it as progressing yourself. Sorry, scratch that. Don't think about it unless you actually have the data to support that. So some of that data can be the 6-minute test. The other thing I would also look at is aerobic efficiency and aerobic decoupling. So if you go into the metrics course, there's a lesson on those two things. Look at those, right? One is measuring how your heart rate, well, they're both measuring heart rate, but one's measuring like how the efficiency on your longer easy runs. Are they staying within a certain percentage? And then the other one is looking at how they're looking at over long runs, but you can also use it over longer workouts. And are you seeing a big jump in your heart rate over the length of time? But and I butchered that a little bit, but go into the course, the training metrics course, and really look into that. And you will go. So if you take those two metrics, and there's Garmin Connect apps that will show you those things. There's Coros, I think, has it actually built into their dashboard. If you have a paid subscription in Strava, you can pull that data. There's things you can do to get that information. And I think it's very useful for people to have it. And it's not something where you're going to be looking at your watch during your run. It's like you look at it after the run and see where you're at, right? But I would do that. And if the data supports that, and then you can support that with a 6-minute test, or you can do a race, whatever the case is, then you can go in and you can adjust the paces accordingly in Final Search, right? You can plug those in specifically. You can say what my new projected marathon time is, and I can put it in that way, and then it'll spit out my new paces and plug those in. But yeah, so if you do go a race, make sure it's something that is in line with what how we talked about in the previous courses, where if I'm doing speed work in some strength, what am I going to want to race? I'm probably going to want to race a 5K or 10K. I don't want to go do a half marathon if my training doesn't support that, right? It's got to support what I'm doing. So yeah, so like I said, the earliest I would do is every 4 to 6 weeks. 4 weeks for experienced runners who have been consistently training. You're probably going to maximize those adaptations a little bit sooner. But if you're a newer runner, I would say at least 6 weeks before doing something like that. More of you're going to see improvement quite a bit early on, but it's more about I want you to maximize the benefits of staying at that level first before just jumping into another level for the sake of jumping into another level. And trust me, if you do a 6-minute test, you run a race, your data is going to improve so much. You don't worry, you're going to be able to make a big jump in that, right? So don't worry about spending an extra 2 weeks at that. It's only going to be more beneficial for you. Okay, so that's about it for this. These are all the things I'm looking at with athletes when we're making sure we're starting at the right paces, progressing them to get from current pace to goal pace. And that's fundamentally how I set a person up. It's how we progress them, and we try to bridge the gaps, how to make sure that they can stay healthy but still reach towards big goals. And it's all about how you start that off. If you can start that off in the right spot, you're going to set yourself up so much better, especially 6 to 8 weeks down the road. And so hopefully you can take some of this with you and apply to your own training. But the big thing is, like, if you've got the plan in and you've got it in Final Surge, you can go in and adjust those paces whenever, right? You can adjust them specifically by your speed and leave the marathon alone, or you can adjust the marathon and leave the speed alone, or you can just use a new projected time and go in and change everything. And either way you want to do it. So you can have a lot of control over that, and it can be very, very beneficial. So the main thing is, though, we want to stay healthy and still make that progress. So, all right, so that is it for this course. If you have questions on anything, don't hesitate to reach out, put these in forums, put these in on your in the groups, whatever case you want to do. And we can further these discussions, clarify anything that you are confused on and or that I might have messed up. And so we can keep this train rolling. All right, hopefully this helps you out. Talk to you later.